Good day to you. It is still the fourth day of December in 2025. We've already produced 4 videos today because we're in the Book of Enoch, and Enoch is the very first prophet. This is the function of science, is finally to get at religion, obviously. That should be patently obvious to you. Otherwise, you should turn this off. So what I do is apply science to religion to validate it, or, if necessary, disprove it. Well, you got both in any religion, because every religion generates traditions, and traditions are unreliable, notoriously unreliable. We covered the most ancient legend of all, the legend of the giants, the Nephilim, because it's a whole legacy of the interaction between angels and humans. The truth of the ancient story of the giants, which was blown out of proportion partially to invalidate the holy transmission of Enoch, the very first prophet. Why would his prophecy need to be challenged by anything, Satan or otherwise? It's because it talks about the elect one, who is also called the righteous one, the faithful and true, the provider of wisdom, the source of wisdom. He doesn't actually say that it's the Son of God. Apparently, that was deemed a necessary fact to obscure because the whole point of religion is to test you for your capacity for love. That's the whole mystery, is that your life as a human is meaningless unless you can conjugate with your source, which, of course, would have to be some form of consciousness that is before you and beyond you. Well, that is a pretty good definition of God. But God is much more capable of defining who he is by his works. And that is the meaning behind all the prophecies. And in fact, all the religions of earth, all through every culture, every era, from the beginning of time until now, every single religion, which is almost all of them. There are exceptions because men are demonically possessed by default. But there is also another game going on. And in fact, Islam teaches correctly that all cultures get a guide, that heaven has its own game to wake men up out of their predicament. And every true religion, which again is most of them, begin with the cycles of nature. The cycles of nature are the direct testimony of God's mind to humans. You don't need a religion. That's your religion. And that's in Psalms 19, just to cite one of innumerable sources. So just to push this home, push this down your throat, it's not pushing it down your throat. It's putting it out in front of you so you can have rational, logical decisions. Otherwise, you have none. You're just told what to think, and you have no control over that. You do, however, have a rational, logical mind, which is programmed to get you out of that trap. How do you do it? You need facts. Where do you think you're going to find the facts that are going to help you make a decision about what your life might mean in any sense? Perhaps you don't care. Well, that's Satan who told you you shouldn't care. Oh, you're a free man? Fuck you. So you need to conjugate somehow with the universe, because you can't find God. He's not visible, but his works are, and they directly testify to everything about him that's knowable. So that's why we need science, is to use the scientific method and process to evaluate myths, to evaluate legends, to evaluate traditions, to evaluate perhaps written records, which are handed down from generation to generation. You don't know where they came from. You weren't there. You don't know who got that document and fucked with it, as was done with the Bible, obviously. The Islam people recognize that. They recognize the prophets, but they're guarded. They're guarded about the prophets because the prophets' messages have been manipulated. Their prophecy was not manipulated. They know where their prophet is from. They know everything they need to know about their prophet. There has never been another prophet like Muhammad. So he is validatable. And Islam, for 1,300 years, has been the only religion ever produced on earth that accepts rational logic as a condition of faith, which is actually what Western culture says that it's doing, as it does everything in its power to disprove the existence of deity. And they've won, they've conquered. Das Untergang des Abendlandes, the going under of the evening lands, the twilight of the Western world, written by Oswald Spengler, a very good Deutsch philosopher who said the West is satanic. There is no question about it. The white race was selected by Satan for the execution of his version of the Islam nation, which is the nation the Creator selected to take the place of Israel and to furnish a vehicle for the revelation of his Son. Now, currently, as I have observed Islam, which I just studied for the first time in my life this year, so I'm a latecomer to Islam, but I know a lot more about Islam than I did in January. Now that this year is complete, I'm going to tell you what I know about Islam. Of course, it's the true religion. They're monotheistic. They base everything on the cycles of nature. Muhammad is absolutely clear about that. He calls them signs, which he ranks right up with the fact that God gave men women and women men. That's supernatural. All these are signs. The wind, the courses of the stars. The Islam people are well known for having revived astronomy, which was eventually transferred to Europe. The Islam people essentially saved Europe from the Dark Ages. And that's well known by historians. But do you know it? You're not allowed to know that. So what about what science has proved about the universe? Well, we know it's expanding, right? Is it? So one thing I want to cover before we get back into the Book of Enoch, to go into his second parable, beginning at the 44th chapter. We're nearing the halfway point of the book. We're a little over 1/3 of the way through the book, the most amazing book I've ever read, although there are quite a few hot contenders like Job, like Shir HaShirim, like Genesis, like the Gospel of John, like the Book of the Apocalypse. Well, there's also the Quran, which I just found out about this year as well. So this has been a wildly good year for me as a scientist and a religious, I guess you would have to say, for lack of a better word, scholar. So the point I'm trying to make is that you have to use logic in order to validate your faith, or you're going to be prey to lies. It's as simple as that. You can see it all over the world, all throughout history. There's some core myth about the creation, and many tribes around the world have a story of the flood. You've heard of the Gilgamesh epic. You have heard that the Nimipu people up in Idaho remember a secondary flood, and they have their own view of the Great Spirit, which is perfectly consonant with a revealed religion. But they also have traditions which are parables and metaphors, and you just got to figure out what they're really talking about when they talk about the monster that was plugging up the inland lake, that the monster, I guess, was killed by a mouse or something. They're always crazy little animals, and then the flood waters made the Columbia Gorge, and that was finally proved in my lifetime that that's exactly what did happen. So the Nimipu were observers in their early occupation of that area. They were around when the floodwaters left over from the Great Flood, quite a while later, emptied out of the Colorado Plateau. First through the Columbia Basin, making the Badlands. All of this was proved, and of course the man who proved it was practically crucified, as you would expect. the men who got the necessary evidence to prove that there was a flood and it wasn't millions of years ago, although this is several different phases. It was discovered what caused the flood. It was the Chicxulub impactors, Chicxulub. Look up Chicxulub crater in Wikipedia. Science discovered the flood in my lifetime. Nobody knew that there was a flood unless they believed it. But now there's scientific evidence. It was due to a comet strike. That's in Wikipedia. But they dated according to Satan's timetable, based on radiometric dating, which is absolutely off. There's no way to date millions of years. It can't be done. We don't know what it was here millions of years ago. What can be proved? There was no ecology more than 10,000 years ago. So the Bible story is true. And the story of the flood has been proved. We see it all over the world. Evidence in the Himalaya mountains. There's limestone at the top with little animals in it, made at the bottom of an ocean. And that mountain is wearing down. So we have a clock in the Himalaya mountains that says how long they've been there and where they came from. It was less than 10,000 years ago. That's been proved. You look at the Colorado Plateau, there are hundreds of thousands of American scientists who would stake their life that the Grand Canyon was formed by receding secondary floodwaters. That's been proved. The geologic column in the Grand Canyon is perfectly analyzable by rational logical methods to show that it wasn't millions of years. That's satanic. And all of your government officials that are there to teach your children as they look, that's hundreds of millions of years ago, children. Well, Ranger Rick is lying in his teeth. He's a servant of demons, giants. The United States is a giant. It's the result of intercourse between fallen angels who are trapped here and human, well, you should say probably the anima of man is susceptible to satanic influence. That's why we get the story of copulation, which is scientifically untrue. Their angels cannot copulate physically, but boy, in the Book of Enoch, it's very insistent that that is exactly what they did. Well, that's insane. That is not true. That is not what Enoch said. That's not what the angel said to Enoch, and that's not what God said to the angel. No, angels do not copulate with women. What, they're all male? Well, why are there male angels but no female angels? That doesn't make sense. That's contrary to revealed religion. God would not do that. He didn't. So why is this insane story in there? To test you. To see if you can see through it. Well, I've given you the magic 3D glasses. You look at the same story. You translate giants to governments. You translate human females with vaginas that can be penetrated by stiff pudenda of angels. What is this, a pornography room? It's spiritual. Because you can't say, he couldn't say, he was not given the information to say explicitly that these angels would fuck with the minds of men. But what a perfect parable, what a perfect metaphor, once you have a wise man to explain it. Well, the time was never until now that you would be able to have that choice. Can you stake your life on that? Can you convert to whatever is the true religion just instantly on the basis of my interpretation of a prophecy? That's not up to me to decide. It's up to you. You're the one who's being tested. Are you human? It's the Gom Jabbar. It's the Gom Jabbar of Dune. Herbert, I think the man's last name was Herbert. I forget his first name. But he wrote the book called Dune. And in there are the B'nai Gesserit, who are basically demonesses or something like that, but they're highly mystical creatures, these women. And they have a test to see if uh, a creature in front of them that looks like a human but might not be. They have a test for that called the Gom Jabbar. You can look that up. You get some articles explaining to you what is the Gom Jabbar. Because according to their philosophy, the B'nai Gesserit, which is a coven of women on Dune, they would need sometimes to test to see if you're human. Well, you can't tell the difference between a satanically possessed human, an ordinary human, or an enlightened by heaven human just by looking at the man's face, unless it glows, as Noah's face was said to glow when he was born. That's in the Book of Enoch. Can you credit that? If you're wise, you can. If you know the ways of heaven, you can. But you sure don't want to be fooled. No rational man wants to be fooled, especially if your life depends on it. So this is very touchy stuff. Well, I dare you to explain why governments exist that are just rapacious. I mean, why can't we fix that? Everybody talks about fixing it, but nobody can lift a finger to make it happen. Israel is brought to trial by South Africa for their genocide. It's proved. Yep, we got them. So the United Nations has to do its job. Well, Satan was sitting there. It's called the United States Delegate to the United Nations. Everybody said, yeah, fuck Israel, stop them. We got to do our job and stop the genocide by issuing restrictions, sanctions against Israel to make them stop, and then, if necessary, bomb them, invade them, make them stop. They can't do that. It's against international law that we all agreed to. The United States just sat there and listened for months or weeks. It was only a couple of years ago, right? And what was the conclusion? Everybody said, fuck Israel, except the United States, who has veto power, because guess who set up the United Nations? Joseph Stalin and Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1945 in Yalta, where I kissed my future bride, the Princess of Ukraine. I kissed her there for the first time. I almost spat on Stalin's chair at the Levadia, but I restrained myself for her sake. Plus, the babushki would have probably dragged me out physically if I did that, mess up their chairs that have been sitting there since 1945. Plus, I didn't know which chair was Stalin's. And if I was a real American, I would have found Franklin Delano Roosevelt's chair and taken a shit on it. There, that's my vote. So the United Nations was set up by Satan for one reason, to validate the new state of Israel, which was only 3 years later. Suddenly, they're back on the map. European Jews? They're not Jews, they're Europeans. So what are they doing there? Killing Islam people, the people of God. Satan is murdering the people of God again. They're not murdering people in the United States because there are no people of God in the United States. They're all in Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the myriad other nations stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific, in the greatest flowering of civilization, culture, and society and religion that this earth has ever seen or ever will. And now Satan's back, oh no, under the control of the white race, the Americans, the Europeans, and now, of course, the white Israelis. Since they're in the land again, they call themselves Israelis. They're in Israel, so they're the Jews who are back in Israel. All lies. Just complete fabrication. Just complete manipulation of reality, history, the truth. What's really going on is wholesale murder. Those people in Gaza are so pathetic that the American public, that normally doesn't care about anything that happens overseas, is actually vitally concerned. But can anybody do anything about it? Not after the United States vetoed any action against its little cousin. And so it's all green lights. And the United Nations finished its job in 1948, but it needed to be kept around for this, for when the Israelis are caught, just obviously the enemies of mankind itself, killing innocent, good people instead of herding them in under the new restored kingdom of God under the Sanhedrin, they're calling for the Sanhedrin now. That's the body of men that murdered Christ and Stephen and the other apostles. They're back. And they're calling, first of all, get rid of the dome. Second of all, finish the job in Gaza, because that's Amalek. They're invoking the Bible to destroy the actual people of God. It doesn't get any worse. And what's next? They're calling now for a complete collection. They're summoning all the white American Jews in Europe. They're all white. Come to Israel. We're calling you back. Within a few generations, they would start to become Semitic again, at least in skin color, and perhaps even in some other way. That's not going to happen. There are not going to be a few generations. They're not going to change. They're white. They're not Semitic. If you're anti-Semitic, what you're actually saying is you're against Iran. You hate Iran because you're a white American racist. That's anti-Semitic. The Semites are in the billions, but the Jews are not part of the Semitic strain. So God chose his own people out of the Abrahamic line to take the place of the Jews and Christians who failed. Christ didn't fail, but Israel did. Because you know who murdered whom. Christ didn't come to murder Israel, but Israel was waiting for Christ. They tried to kill him as a baby. His own family turned on him. That's in Scripture. It's very infrequently cited by American evangelical servants of the Great One. Blessed be his name forever, but they're not his children. So who is? Well, in this modern age, under the beautiful, wonderful culture of Islam, logic is now allowed in religion, and in fact is a criterion of faith. You have to choose to believe. You're not believing fantasy or fairy tales. Everything is known from the Quran. That has everything in it that you need to convert to the way of heaven. You don't need anything else. What about the Son of God? Well, they think that the Son of God was invented by the Catholic Church. So, big, blind, just a big hunk of shit in their eyes. They can't see the Son because Satan has blocked them from seeing the Son of God. That's not because of Muhammad. That's because of their traditions, the Hadith. Not even the companions, who were those who were alive at the same time as Muhammad. It was because of the development over 13 centuries of a way of dealing with Catholicism, which they knew perfectly well was satanic. Everyone knows that now, but they can't be stopped either. They still have millions of adherents who still take the cracker, the body of Christ. They worship a man in Rome or wherever, and they just don't know anything about the way of heaven because they got theirs, mate. They're rich. They own all the high places. That was Satan's rule for about 1,500 years. And Islam came within an ace of capturing the Pope and destroying that monstrosity, in which case Europe would have been enlightened. But you see, that would remove the test that's set by heaven to test your love. You have to choose heaven and God of your own free will. No one can force you, or it's not love. You're not going into heaven unless you love God. How can you love that which you've been told to hate? Well, if you're raised that way, you have no choice unless heaven reaches in to help you. That's always done, but you may miss your opportunity because you're obstinate, you're sinful, you don't want anything except what you're told to want, which is money in the United States. So we're going to be reading further from the most amazing book I've ever read among at least a dozen amazing books. By the way, China does have a valid religion. They talk about the creative force in the I Ching. I've given several video lectures on that. That's their religion. It's perfectly good. Is there a tradition surrounding it that ruins it? Isn't there always? There's the giants. You know, there's always something that ruins everything, so you don't have to make any decision at all. That's to Satan's advantage, that you don't decide anything that's important. Well, with science on our side, we know there was a flood, and so we can validate the elect one. He is the Son of God. How do we know that? He said so. Enoch didn't, but the Israeli prophets did. And of course, Israel just ignored it. In fact, they murdered those prophets who dared to say something against the Sanhedrin. And when Christ showed up, the Sanhedrin caught him, beat him half to death, and then murdered him, using the Romans as their factotum, just as the United States is using Israel, or the other way around. So that's our introduction to our next reading, Enoch's second parable. This is very close to the actual beginning of the book, which begins at chapter 37. And the first 36 chapters are largely about other things. But now we turn to the parables. We're done with Enoch's journeys in heaven for the time being, and we're done with the story of the Nephilim and the giants, which is actually a parable about governments. Who are the giants? The United States is the biggest giant of all. Not true. Israel is, because Israel has the chief of the fallen angels at its helm, because they need guidance to complete the job, which, as I predicted when I was 13 years old, based on economic and political and military reasoning, that by about this time in history, the United States would be looking at the oil in the Gulf of Oman and Saudi Arabia. So far, Saudi Arabia is towing Satan's line, but Iran is forced to sell its oil because that's about its only source of mega income. And the United States and Israel have their eye on that oil. And no politician is going to say this is over resources, so we win the end game against China and Russia. Who's we, white man? As my mother would say, she may have had a touch of prophecy in her. So we'll be right back. There's a full moon. Take a look at it. That's your first lesson in your whole life in geometry, whenever it was, about the age of 5. And you tried to see the edge of the universe. And now I've finally answered that ancient conundrum that every child and every adult would love to have solved. Well, I'm in the business of solving all paradoxes. I have all the answers in science and religion, including defining for the first time in history what is science for. Well, it certainly isn't for technology. That's Satan's game. He needed to get into outer space. He needs to splice genes because he's going to defend himself against the invasion of the armies of heaven, which is coming up so quickly that in a moment it's going to be on you and you're going to realize it's too late. And then you're going to gnaw your tongue for pain. You will wish to die and you won't be able to. And you're going to scream your heart out until you wish you could die of the grief from your stupidity. Because you'll know you've been hoodwinked. Well, that's what a prophet is meant to address, to give you choices. Nobody can force your love. That has to come from your heart. But if it doesn't, heaven knows who you are. So beware. Here's the lab cat giving us her blessing. She loves it when I give a video presentation because she knows she can come over at the right time. She's a very polite, very regal cat. And she gets her back rub, which now she cherishes. And she licks my hand and she shows in every way that she approves of her boy. I hope that heaven has the same regard for you as I do for this cat. Pure love, voluntary. You're going in if you choose the way of heaven, which is love. If you resist, it'll be obvious what you are, and you're not going in. That's what Muhammad said. That's what Yeshua said. That's what Enoch said. That's what all the prophets say. You have a choice. It's still your turn. I'm giving you choices in this great game. Choose the evidence of creation to validate the existence of your loving Creator. The cycles of nature and the cycles of heaven. We're getting to that part, the luminaries, the first book of astronomy of all time. We'll be right back. Thank you.